A single conversation might jump from the price of grain to the latest military campaign, weaving together local concerns with imperial affairs. The coffee house gave ordinary citizens, who had no place in the halls of power, a forum to voice opinions and measure the mood of the city. This openness, however, did not escape the attention of the authorities. Sultans and their viziers quickly recognized that coffee houses could act as incubators for dissent. Political satire, woven subtly into a storyteller's tale or a shadow puppet play, could carry sharper criticism than any public speech. News, real or exaggerated, spread rapidly from one coffee house to another, often faster than the state could control. Some rulers tried to curb the influence of these establishments. In the 17th century, Sultan Murad IV famously banned coffee entirely, sending soldiers to patrol the streets for violators. The official reasoning was moral. Coffee was accused of fostering idleness and moral decay, but the underlying concern was its role in gathering politically minded crowds. Still, even under such bans, coffee houses often operated in secret, their doors closing quickly at the sight of patrols, the aroma of brewing coffee hidden behind the smell of cooking. Despite intermittent crackdowns, the political life of the coffee house persisted. In many ways, it was the Ottoman equivalent of a public square combined with a newsroom. Ideas could be tested here, grievances aired, and alliances forged over shared cups. By the 18th century, the authorities realized that coffee houses were too deeply ingrained in urban life to eliminate. Instead, some rulers placed informants among the patrons, listening to the flow of conversation and reporting back to the palace. In this way, the coffee house remained both a symbol of free exchange and a reminder that in the Ottoman Empire, even the most casual conversation could carry weight in the corridors of power. One of the most remarkable features of the Ottoman coffee house was its ability to bring together people who, outside its doors, might never share the same space. In a society layered with social, economic and professional divisions, the coffee house blurred boundaries in ways few other institutions could. A typical Istanbul coffee house in the 17th or 18th century might host an astonishing mix. A bearded imam pausing between lessons at the mosque, a wealthy silk merchant from the bazaar, a weathered sailor fresh from the docks, a janissary in full uniform, and a poet seeking inspiration. Here they sat side by side on wooden benches, sipping from the same kind of cup, listening to the same storyteller, laughing at the same witty remark. This social mixing was partly due to coffee itself. Unlike wine, it carried no religious prohibition, and unlike lavish feasts, it was affordable to most city dwellers. A single serving cost little, making it accessible to apprentices, artisans, and labourers. At the same time, the refined preparation and elegant presentation appealed to scholars, officials, and members of the elite. Occupations often shaped coffee house clientele. Certain venues became unofficial headquarters for specific trades. Porters gathered in one, scribes in another, sailors in a third. Yet even in these specialized settings, visitors from outside the trade were welcome, drawn in by the warmth of the stove in winter or the cool shade in summer. Religious and ethnic diversity also played a role. In cosmopolitan cities like Istanbul, Aleppo, and Salonika, Muslims, Christians, and Jews sometimes shared the same coffee house, especially in neighborhoods where trade and travel brought communities into close contact. Though tensions could flare, the shared rituals of ordering, serving, and drinking coffee often smoothed over differences, at least for the length of a cup. This mingling of classes and communities was both the charm and the danger of the coffee house. For ordinary people, it offered a rare chance to hear perspectives far beyond their own circle. News from distant provinces, gossip from the palace, or philosophical musings from a learned stranger. For the authorities, however, the idea of janissaries chatting freely with merchants, or artisans debating with scholars, hinted at a dangerous levelling of social hierarchies. Still, it was precisely this blend of voices that gave the Ottoman coffee house its unique energy. Within its walls, status mattered less than wit, eloquence, and the ability to hold your own in conversation, a small but significant taste of equality in a hierarchical world. In the Ottoman Empire, the coffee house was a male-dominated space, a public stage where politics, games and debates unfolded among men of all ranks. Women, by custom and social expectation, did not frequent these establishments. This absence has often led to the impression that coffee culture was an exclusively male domain, but the reality was more complex. Women were deeply involved in the culture of coffee, just in different settings. In the private sphere of the home, coffee played a central role in hospitality, courtship and social visits. A young woman's skill at brewing coffee could even influence marriage prospects, and elaborate serving sets became prized possessions in a dowry. Female guests were served coffee in gilded cups, often alongside sweetmeats, and these intimate gatherings mirrored the conversational and leisurely spirit of the public coffeehouse, just without the public exposure. Some wealthier women participated in coffee culture through the imperial court. In the Topkapi Palace, elite women of the harem enjoyed coffee as a daily luxury, served by specialized coffee attendants. The harem's women, particularly the Valide Sultan and favored consorts, could influence politics indirectly, and coffee became one of many luxuries around which courtly intrigues and discussions took place. While it was rare for women to step into public coffeehouses, there were exceptions. In cosmopolitan port cities or frontier towns, foreign women, particularly from Europe, sometimes visited out of curiosity, recorded in travellers' accounts as spectacles that surprised local patrons. In certain provincial towns, mixed-gender coffeehouses existed on the margins of Ottoman norms, though they were often tied to inns, markets or entertainment venues. The question of women's presence in coffeehouses occasionally entered public debate. Conservative critics feared that any mingling of men and women in such spaces could erode moral boundaries. Yet these same critics often ignored the vibrant female coffee culture that thrived behind closed doors, where women engaged in the same games, storytelling, and gossip that enlivened the male spaces. In the 19th century, as Ottoman society modernized, new public venues such as European-style cafes and patisseries began to blur these gender divisions. Women of the upper and middle classes, particularly in cosmopolitan centres like Istanbul and Izmir, began to appear in select public coffeehouses, still a minority, but a sign that the boundaries were shifting. Thus, while the Ottoman coffeehouse in its classic form remained a male preserve, women were never absent from coffee culture itself. They simply nurtured their own parallel tradition, one equally rich in conversation, hospitality, and the ritual pleasure of the brew. For all their popularity, Ottoman coffeehouses lived under a shadow of suspicion. To the sultans and their advisors, these bustling hubs of conversation were double-edged swords, places of social bonding, yes, but also fertile ground for gossip, satire, and potentially dangerous political talk. The first major crackdown came in the early 17th century under Sultan Murad IV, a ruler famed for his strictness and his personal austerity. Murad believed coffeehouses encouraged idleness, undermined public morals, and, most dangerously, served as meeting grounds for dissenters. In 1633, after a devastating fire in Istanbul, blamed, perhaps unfairly, on careless coffeehouse patrons, Murad ordered the closure of all such establishments. Coffee itself was banned, and violators faced harsh punishments, sometimes even execution. Yet the closures never truly killed coffeehouse culture. Many establishments went underground, operating discreetly behind shuttered doors or disguised as private homes. Patrons learned to hide their cups and sezves at the first sign of patrols. The bans became a cat-and-mouse game between authorities and citizens, with enforcement varying depending on the ruler's temperament. Later sultans, while less severe than Murad, still treated coffeehouses warily. The concern was not just moral decay, but political risk. The Janissary Corps, whose loyalty was vital but unpredictable, often gathered in coffeehouses. These meetings could be harmless camaraderie, or the seedbed for mutinies. In times of unrest, shutting down coffeehouses became an easy way for the government to disrupt potential conspiracies. Even in peaceful times, coffeehouses drew suspicion because they were hard to control. Unlike the mosque, they were not under direct religious supervision. Unlike the marketplace, they were not tied to official trade guilds. They were semi-autonomous spaces, run by private owners and filled with free-flowing talk, a combination that made bureaucrats uneasy. Some rulers tried regulation, rather than outright bans. Licenses were introduced, taxes imposed, and in some cases, state informants were placed among the patrons. Storytellers and performers were warned against crossing certain political lines, though many found clever ways to veil criticism in allegory or humour. In the end, coffeehouses proved remarkably resilient. Each ban only seemed to deepen public affection for them, turning the act of sharing a cup of coffee into a quiet gesture of defiance. This tug-of-war between the people's love of coffee and the state's mistrust of its gathering places became one of the most enduring themes in the Ottoman coffeehouse story. By the twilight of the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the coffeehouse had already outlived bans, moral crusades, and political suspicion. What began as a Yemeni import in the 1500s had grown into an institution so deeply woven into urban life that it was impossible to imagine the empire without it. Even as railways, telegraphs, and European-style cafes transformed city life, the traditional Ottoman coffeehouse retained its magnetic pull. Its influence stretched far beyond the walls of its smoky interiors. The coffeehouse had shaped the way Ottomans socialized, debated, and even thought. It had nurtured storytellers, poets, musicians, and amateur philosophers. It had been both a cradle of high art and a stage for everyday humour, where a porter's sharp joke could earn as much applause as a scholar's polished verse. It was a school for listening as much as speaking, a place where news was sifted, opinions tested, and worldviews expanded. The political dimension never disappeared. Even in the empire's final decades, coffeehouses served as unofficial newsrooms, where discussions about constitutional reform, modernization, and the empire's place in a rapidly changing world could flow more freely than in official venues. Many of the ideas that would shape the early Turkish Republic and modern Middle Eastern politics were first debated over small porcelain cups in such spaces. Culturally, the Ottoman coffeehouse left an enduring mark on architecture, literature, and daily ritual. The image of men gathered under low-hanging lamps, smoke curling upward, dice clattering on wooden boards, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee lingering in the air became a defining scene of Ottoman urban identity. Even today, in cities like Istanbul, Sarajevo, and Cairo, echoes of this tradition live on in neighbourhood kahvehaneler, where the pace is unhurried and conversation flows as steadily as the drink itself. Globally, the Ottoman coffeehouse contributed to the spread of coffee culture far beyond its borders. European travellers carried the idea home, and by the 17th century, coffeehouses in London, Paris, and Vienna were thriving, direct heirs to their Ottoman counterparts in both form and function. The legacy of the Ottoman coffeehouse is not just the drink, but the ideal it embodied, a space where people of different walks of life could gather, exchange ideas, and feel part of something larger than themselves. In a world that changes faster with each generation, that simple promise, a seat at the table, a cup in hand, and a voice in the conversation, remains as powerful as ever. For the samurai, armour, known as yoroi, was far more than a shield against arrows and blades. It was a second skin, a portable biography, and a public declaration of loyalty. Every curve of lacquered plate, every knot of silk cord, every crest painted in gold, carried meaning that went beyond the battlefield. In a society built upon rigid hierarchies and deep respect for heritage, armour acted as a visible signature of a warrior's lineage. The family crest, or mon, was often emblazoned on the helmet, kabuto, shoulder guards, sode, and sometimes even on the breastplate, do. To see a warrior's mon was to know his clan, his ancestors, and the legacy he carried into battle. This was not mere decoration. It was an unspoken vow to uphold the honour of those who had worn the same emblem before him. Colour was another silent language. Certain hues were reserved for high-ranking families or carried symbolic associations. Crimson could signal courage and a willingness to shed blood for one's lord. Black lacquer conveyed dignity and gravitas. Gold leaf suggested both wealth and divine protection. These choices were deliberate. Every tint and tone was meant to project a specific image to friend and foe alike. Patterns and ornamentation often drew on spiritual symbolism. A helmet might be crowned with a crest shaped like a dragon to invoke ferocity, or adorned with antlers to channel the power and endurance of the stag. Some samurai incorporated motifs from Shinto and Buddhist beliefs: lotus flowers for purity, waves for resilience, or the rising sun for imperial loyalty. These emblems served as talismans, a constant reminder of the warrior's virtues and the spiritual forces he called upon in combat. Even the lacquered finish itself was more than practical. The glossy surface repelled water and protected the underlying metal or leather, but it also created an almost mirror-like sheen, allowing the armor to gleam in sunlight. A subtle form of intimidation on the battlefield. When an enemy faced a line of samurai, each gleaming suit was a declaration: we are ready, we are united, and we carry the weight of history on our shoulders. To wear yoroi was to embody one's clan, faith, and personal honor. In the mind of the samurai, the armor was not simply clothing for war, it was an extension of the soul. Removing it after battle was not just a matter of loosening cords, it was a return from a heightened state of being, where every plate and knot had transformed a man into the living image of his lineage. For the samurai, putting on armor was never done in haste. It was a deliberate, almost ceremonial act, one that could take an hour or more when done properly. This was not merely about strapping on protection. It was about mentally and spiritually crossing the threshold from daily life into the disciplined state of readiness for combat. The process often began with purification. Some warriors would wash their hands and face with clean water, or even perform brief Shinto rites to honor the kami, spirits, and seek their blessing. Others might recite a short Buddhist sutra for protection or focus silently on their breathing to steady the mind. Going into battle was not just a physical trial, it was a moral and spiritual one, and the act of donning armor was the gateway. Undergarments came first. A light cotton or silk kimono was worn next to the skin, providing comfort and a base layer to prevent chafing. Over this, a padded jacket, shitagi, and hidate, thigh guards, would be fitted. These pieces ensured that the heavier plates could be worn for hours without exhausting the body. Each layer was tied with precision, the cords adjusted so they would not loosen in the chaos of battle. Next came the armored components in a carefully ordered sequence. The sunite, shin guards, were strapped on first, followed by the coat, armored sleeves. Then the do, or cuirass, was placed around the torso and tied securely at the sides. This central piece was often the most ornate, bearing the clan crest prominently. The sword, shoulder guards, followed, wide and flaring to protect against downward strikes. The helmet, kabuto, was often left for last, as it signaled the final moment before readiness. Secured under the chin with a shinobi no-o cord, the kabuto's weight and enclosed feeling reminded the warrior that from this point forward, he was no longer an individual. He was a samurai in battle form. Assistants, usually retainers or fellow warriors, often helped in the process. This was not simply for efficiency, but as a mark of trust and solidarity. The act of tying another man's armor was intimate and significant. It meant you were preparing him for life or death struggle. By the time the final knot was tightened and the last plate polished with a sleeve, the samurai was transformed. The ritual of preparation had honed his focus, anchored his resolve, and reminded him that he carried not just his own fate, but the honor of his clan into whatever lay ahead. Among all the pieces of samurai armor, none carried more symbolic and psychological weight than the kabuto, the helmet. It was the final piece placed upon the warrior's head before stepping into battle, and with it came a transformation, not just in appearance, but in spirit. If the yoroi was the body of the samurai's honor, the kabuto was its crown. The design of a kabuto was as much art as it was engineering. Its bowl, or hachi, was often made from dozens of overlapping metal plates riveted together, creating a structure strong enough to deflect arrows and sword strikes. The front featured a visor, mabizashi, sometimes curved outward to shield the eyes and add a fearsome silhouette. At the back, layered neck guards called shikoro fanned out, protecting the nape without restricting movement. But the kabuto's function extended far beyond protection. It was a visual declaration. Many bore elaborate maedate, crest-like ornaments mounted on the front, which could take the form of gilded horns, fearsome demons, dragons, or stylized clan emblems. These designs were not random decoration. They were carefully chosen symbols meant to inspire allies, intimidate enemies, and proclaim the wearer's identity across the battlefield. A warrior advancing under a pair of towering antlers or a golden sunburst was instantly recognizable, even in the chaos of combat. Inside the kabuto, the ukabari, a silk or cotton lining, helped absorb sweat and provided comfort. The helmet was secured by the shinobi no-o, a cord tied firmly beneath the chin. This knot was critical. If too loose, the helmet could slip at a decisive moment, but if too tight, it could choke the wearer during exertion. Adjusting it was a small but deliberate act, signalling that the samurai was now fully enclosed in his warlike form. There was also etiquette in how the kabuto was handled. It was never placed carelessly on the ground or tossed aside. When not worn, it might rest on a lacquered stand, sometimes displayed in a position of honor in the warrior's home. In ceremonies, it was polished until it gleamed, reflecting the care and pride of its owner. The kabuto was more than just a piece of armor. It was a statement of readiness, a banner for the head, and often a family heirloom passed from one generation to the next. When a samurai lowered it onto his head, it was the final step in a transformation from man to warrior, sealing his role as both protector and representative of his clan's honor. If the kabuto was the crown of the samurai, the do, the cuirass, was its beating heart. This central piece protected the torso, the core of the warrior's body, where a single well-placed arrow or sword thrust could end a life. But the do was more than just protection. It was the canvas upon which a samurai displayed his clan identity, personal taste, and even his philosophy of combat. The do evolved over centuries, beginning as heavy iron or leather plates, and gradually transforming into the lacquered, segmented marvels of the Sengoku period. The armor was often constructed from horizontal lames, kozain, small scales of iron or hardened leather, laced together with silk cords in intricate patterns. These cords, called odoshi, were not just functional. Their colors carried symbolic meaning and could denote rank, clan, or battlefield role. Wearing the do followed its own etiquette. It was fastened around the torso with cords tied in precise knots, ensuring a snug fit without restricting breathing. The front and back panels overlapped to provide extra strength over vital areas. A well-fitted do allowed the samurai to twist, draw his bow, or wield his sword with minimal hindrance, a reminder that mobility was as important as protection. The surface of the do was often a work of art. Some bore the family crest, mon, in gold leaf. Others featured lacquered designs of dragons, waves, or clouds, invoking strength, resilience, and divine favor. These motifs could act as talismans, imbuing the warrior with a sense of invincibility. For those of higher rank, the finish was immaculate, the lacquer polished to a deep shine that caught the light on the battlefield, an intimidating sight for any opponent. Donning the do was a moment of transition. Assistants or retainers might hold it in place as the cords were tightened, checking each knot for security. For a samurai, this step was both practical and symbolic. The chest, home to the heart and lungs, was now shielded by the honor of the clan. In some traditions, a warrior might whisper a brief prayer at this stage, acknowledging the vulnerability of his body and placing his fate in the hands of the gods. Once secured, the do gave the samurai the feeling of being encased in resolve. It was the literal and metaphorical core of his armor, a piece that carried his family's history on its surface and guarded his life beneath its plates. While the do protected the core, a samurai could not fight effectively without safeguarding his limbs. The arms and legs were the moving parts of combat, constantly exposed during swordplay, archery, and mounted charges. For this reason, the sode, kote, and sunita were essential, not just for protection but for balance and agility. The sode, or shoulder guards, were large, rectangular plates that hung from the upper arm, shielding the shoulders and part of the upper torso. Constructed from lacquered iron or leather scales laced together, they flared outward to deflect downward strikes from swords or spears. Their movement was carefully calibrated, loose enough to allow the arm to raise a bow or swing a katana, but secure enough to stay in place during rapid maneuvers. Often they bore the family crest, or were color-coordinated with the do, ensuring the entire suit looked unified. The kote protected the arms from wrist to shoulder. These armored sleeves were made from a combination of chainmail, kusari, metal splints, and fabric padding. The outer arm was heavily reinforced, while the inner arm remained more flexible for ease of motion. Kote were tied at several points to keep them snug, preventing loose fabric from catching on a weapon or an opponent's armor. In close combat, kote could mean the difference between a deflected sword cut and a severed arm. The sunite, or shin guards, shielded the lower legs, a part of the body often targeted in foot combat to destabilize an opponent. Made from vertical iron splints sewn onto cloth or leather backing, sunite were secured with straps behind the calf. The design allowed a warrior to kneel, run, or mount a horse without the plates digging into the skin. Their lacquered surfaces resisted mud and rain, vital in the unpredictable conditions of battlefields. Fitting these limb pieces was a methodical process. The sunite went on first, followed by the kote, and finally the sode. Each step checked for comfort and stability. Assistants often adjusted them to ensure no part of the armor shifted in the heat of combat. Beyond function, these components completed the samurai's silhouette. The flaring sode, articulated kote, and sturdy sunite gave the warrior a balanced, imposing form. They were the moving defenses of the armor, enabling offense and defense to work in harmony, proof that samurai armor was as much about precision engineering as it was about ceremony and honor. In the art of samurai armor, the lower body was never neglected. While the upper torso and head drew the most attention, strikes to the thighs, hips, and groin could be just as lethal. The Heidate and Kusazuri formed the essential defenses for this vulnerable region, allowing the warrior to move freely while shielding him from slashes, arrows, and glancing spear thrusts. The Heidate were thigh guards worn beneath the Kusazuri, strapped directly over the kimono or padded undergarments. They consisted of small rectangular iron or leather plates sewn onto a fabric panel, which wrapped around the front of the thighs like an apron. The design ensured flexibility. The plates overlapped slightly to provide coverage without locking the legs into rigid positions. When kneeling or riding, the Heidate flexed naturally, preserving agility in the heat of battle. Above them hung the Kusazuri, skirt-like strips that extended downward from the bottom edge of the do. Usually made in multiple flaring panels, the Kusazuri were constructed from rows of lacquered scales laced together, matching the colour and style of the cuirass. Their primary role was to protect the hips, pelvis, and upper thighs, areas particularly exposed when the samurai leaned forward in combat or while mounted. The Kusazuri also served an aesthetic function, completing the visual unity of the armour. They expanded the silhouette of the samurai, making him appear broader and more imposing. The rhythmic sway of the panels as the warrior moved added to his presence, almost like the robes of a ceremonial dancer. Except these panels could deflect a sword blow. Fitting these pieces was part of the armor's careful ritual. The Heidate were tied first, snug around the waist and upper legs. Then the Kusazuri, already attached to the do, were adjusted to hang evenly. The spacing between the panels was crucial. Too tight, and the panels would hinder leg movement. Too loose, and they might leave dangerous gaps in protection. Symbolically, these lower body defenses represented steadfastness and stability. Just as a building relied on a strong foundation, a samurai relied on his lower body for power in strikes, balance in stances, and endurance in long battles. Protecting it was both a practical necessity and a metaphor for protecting the base of one's strength. Together, the Heidate and Kusazuri turned vulnerable flesh into a fortified base, enabling the samurai to move with confidence, knowing that every step forward was supported by both engineering and tradition. A samurai's armor might have been built from steel, leather, and lacquer, but it was the cords and belts that held the entire ensemble together. Without them, the suit would be nothing more than a scattered pile of plates. The obi, the broad belt, and the network of himo, armor cords, were the hidden lifelines of Yoroi, binding not only its parts but also the warrior's sense of order, discipline, and composure. The obi was the foundation. Worn snugly around the waist, it supported the weight of the swords and sometimes even bore part of the armor's load. Made from thickly woven silk or cotton, the obi was strong, yet flexible, able to be tightened or loosened quickly as needed. When donning armor, it was usually tied first, ensuring a stable base before adding heavier components like the do and kusazuri. The obi also positioned the swords correctly, katana edge up on one side, wakizashi or tanto on the other, so that drawing them was fluid even under the encumbrance of armor. The himo, or armor cords, were more intricate. These silk laces threaded through small holes in the plates, binding components together in a system both functional and decorative. The pattern and colour of the lacing could identify a clan or indicate rank, but the practical role was paramount. These cords kept armour sections articulated and secure during combat. Tying them was an art. Assistants often helped weave and knot the cords, ensuring each section sat precisely where it should. A poorly tied knot could mean disaster in battle, a loose sewed flapping at the wrong moment, a shifting do that exposed the ribs. For this reason, tying armour was done with the same seriousness as sharpening a blade. Knots themselves carried etiquette. Certain ties were meant to be easily undone for quick removal after battle, while others were locked tightly for maximum security. Samurai trained to know the difference, both for their own armour and when assisting comrades. Symbolically, these bindings represented unity, between armour pieces, between warrior and clan, and between the physical and spiritual preparation for battle. A fully laced suit was a complete whole, just as the samurai's body, mind, and purpose were aligned once he was ready to fight. In the end, the cords and belt were more than practical fasteners. They were the invisible threads that turned separate parts into a living suit of honour, holding together not just the armour, but the warrior's readiness to step onto the battlefield. For a samurai, armour was not merely equipment. It was an heirloom, a companion, and often a sacred object. To neglect it was to dishonour oneself and one's ancestors. Just as a blade required constant sharpening, armour demanded regular care to keep it battle-ready and worthy of the warrior who wore it. After combat or training, the armour was carefully dismantled piece by piece. Each component, kabuto, do, sode, kote, hidate, sunita, was inspected for damage. Dents in metal plates were hammered out by skilled armourers, while frayed cords were replaced with new silk lacing, often dyed to match the original colour. Any chips in the lacquer were touched up, both to preserve the armour's appearance and to protect it from rust. Moisture was the armour's greatest enemy. After a rainy campaign or a humid summer battle, every plate was wiped dry, and the cords aired to prevent mould. Armour was often stored in a dry chest, sometimes lined with rice straw to absorb humidity. The kabuto might be displayed on a lacquered stand, but it was always covered with a cloth to shield it from dust and sunlight. Cleaning was not just practical, it was ceremonial. Some samurai treated the process as a form of meditation, taking the time to reflect on the battle just fought and to prepare mentally for the next. The slow rhythm of untying cords, wiping lacquer, and folding garments became a way of transitioning from the heightened state of combat back to the stillness of everyday life. Respect for armour extended to how it was handled. Dropping a piece carelessly, stepping over it, or placing it in a dirty spot was considered deeply disrespectful. When not in use, armour was stored neatly and in a specific order, ready to be donned quickly if duty called. The armour's longevity was a testament to this care. Well-maintained suits could be passed down for generations, each layer of lacquer and every repaired plate telling the story of past battles. Some samurai even inscribed small messages or prayers inside their armour, knowing that one day their descendants might wear it. In this way, maintenance was not just about preserving a tool of war, It was about honoring a living symbol of duty, loyalty, and family heritage. To tend one's armor was to tend one's honor, ensuring that when the time came to wear it again, it would be as ready as the warrior himself. If putting on armor was a ritual of transformation, removing it was a ritual of return. For the samurai, taking off yoroi was never done casually. It marked the end of a period in which he had been more than just a man. He had been the embodiment of his clan's honor, a living weapon, and a guardian of his lord's will. The process began with stillness. After battle or duty, a samurai would stand or kneel as assistants untied the cords, starting from the outermost pieces. The sode and kusazuri were usually removed first, their silk laces loosened with deliberate care to avoid tangling. The clatter of lacquered plates hitting one another was the soundtrack of a warrior shedding his martial shell. The kabuto came next, lifted slowly from the head and placed respectfully on a stand or wrapped in cloth. Removing the helmet was symbolic. It marked the moment when the warrior's mind could lower its guard. For many, the feeling of air on sweat-damp hair was as much an emotional release as a physical one. The do, being the heart of the armor, was often taken off last among the major plates. As it opened and slipped away, the weight lifted from the shoulders was both literal and symbolic. The samurai's body was free again, but so too was his spirit, released from the focused intensity required in armor. Once all the plates were removed, the undergarments were folded neatly and set aside for washing. Assistants or the samurai himself would then inspect each piece for damage, beginning the process of maintenance immediately if needed. Armor was never left scattered. Each component was stored in its proper place, ready for the next call to arms. For some, the removal ritual included a brief prayer of thanks, gratitude for survival, for the armor's protection, and for the honor of fulfilling one's duty. In times of peace, the ritual might be followed by tea or quiet reflection, a way of re-entering daily life with composure. The etiquette of removing armor reminded the samurai that battle was not the only state of existence. Just as a warrior had to know how to fight, he also had to know how to set aside the trappings of war and resume the roles of leader, father, or servant. In this way, the ritual of removal was not an end, but a bridge, connecting the world of combat to the world of living, and ensuring the samurai remained whole in